What if I told you that New Testament scholars doubt the veracity of the Christian faith, or that sometimes they wonder if Jesus is who he says he was? Would you be surprised? We speak to a scholar that once fit this description. We will hear his story of doubt, what questions led to that place, and the answers that pulled him out. Hello, doubters. Welcome to Dealing with Deconstruction. If you find yourself questioning some of your deepest held beliefs and wondering if you can hold on to your Christian faith, you are in the right place. This is a safe place where we examine the questions that people on the same journey ask, and we are looking for truth. If you feel lonely and ask many bigger-than-life questions, please consider subscribing. Also, consider shooting me an email with some of your story. Today, we are going to hear from Dr. Mike Licona and his story of doubt. Mike has a PhD in New Testament. He has completed all requirements with distinction and the highest marks. He is a frequent speaker on university campuses, churches, Christian groups, retreats, frequently debates, and has appeared as a guest on dozens of radio and television programs. He is a member of the Evangelical, Theological, and Philosophical Societies, the Institute for Biblical Research, the Society of Biblical Literature, and others. Mike is an associate professor in theology at Houston Baptist University and the president of Risen Jesus. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tim. Great to be on with you.
Well, man, Mike, I have followed your work for a number of years, read a number of your articles and books, watched several of your videos. I have interviewed you before, or I've been in the background when you've been interviewed by our good friend Bobby Conway, the 1 Minute Apologist. So I'm excited to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Tim. I'm excited to see your new channel.
Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate you being part of kind of the, first batch of interviews here. So, well, Mike, as I said in the intro, there was a time when you feel like things were kind of crumbling down around you when it came to your Christian worldview. I would love for you to kind of just take us to that moment and explain what was going on in your world that led right up to you feeling like you're starting to really have some serious doubts.
Well, Tim, there's actually been a couple of times. I don't discuss I usually, when people ask me, I'll tell them about the first time. And that was when I was just in grad school. I was in my final semester. And, I felt like I had a good relationship with God. Was praying about 2 hours a day, was studying scripture several hours a day. I was, focusing on the New Testament, reading it in its original language, Greek. And one day I just kind of asked myself, how do I know this stuff is true? I believe it's true. I believe I've got this relationship with the Lord, but don't people of other religious beliefs have the same kind of confidence? How do I know that what I believe is true rather than I've just kind of brainwashed myself? And that led me to doubt my faith for the first time in my life. And Gary Habermas really helped me through that. There were times after that, when like with the you start to study more in depth about the Gospels. You find out that, a lot of scholars are questioning whether Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote them, and all, contradictions and all this kind of stuff and other things about the Bible. And so that caused me severe doubts as well, because, I was brought up in a Christian family. And so I had these, a conservative Christian family. And so I had these conservative beliefs, and anything that kind of challenged them, it's almost like a house of cards, that falls if you just pull out one of those cards, which is really a bad approach, not necessarily the conservative approach, but the approach that it's a house of cards, and you take any of those away, like biblical inerrancy or something, and you can't even trust whether Christianity is true. But another time that I really doubted my faith was, it was around 1997, 1998, and we were really struggling financially at that point. I was in estate planning. I was dealing with senior adults and really trying to do good with them and to help them with their estates. And in 1997, I ruptured a disc in my back, and I was out of work for a little bit, and I was self-employed, and boy, I was just trying to plow through it, and it was really difficult, and it really hurt us financially. And then my wife's dad, my father-in-law, was dying of cancer. He would succumb to cancer in June of '98, but he's dying of cancer, and my wife and kids go out to spend several months with him out in Nebraska. And so we're apart from one another and we're struggling financially. And so we get on the phone and we're arguing, and our marriage is suffering as a result. It was just a really tough time. And I'm out praying one night, and I'm thinking, the more I'm praying, the worse things are getting. And could that be because, if God does not exist, this is entirely consistent with it? But yet, on the other hand, am I in kind of a Job moment where, I can curse God and just move on, or do I just trust him and continue on with my faith? So that was like one of those defining moments in my faith journey. So yeah, that's kind of the things that the big things that have led me to doubt at times. And
Yeah.
there's been some other times I've doubted as well.
Right. So in that one that you just spoke about kind of at the end there, where there was some turmoil going on with your family, your father-in-law was passing away or dealing with cancer, which is again a horrific thing to go through both personally and in your family. Just tell us a little bit about some of the things that kind of got you out of that. You said that you were praying. So what were some of the steps that you took to then assuage some of that and feel like you got yourself back on track in a sense, or could trust again?
Well, a lot of it was just continuing, just making a decision to say, I'm going to continue with this. I'm where else, it's like what Peter said, where else do we have to go?
Yeah.
I could have gone with atheism or something. I had looked at other world religions. I wasn't convinced by the evidence for them. I mean, someone might say that there's not enough evidence to convince them Christianity is true, but there's more evidence for Christianity than there is for other world religions. So I'm not going to go to something that's less evidence than Christianity.
Right.
I believe that the scientific and philosophical evidence for God's existence is better than what we have for atheism. So it's like, well, where else am I going to go? Maybe I would go to a non-specific theism kind of thing. God exists, he acts in our world at times, but there's no specific God in whom I need to believe. So it was just a conscious decision to move on. But I would say that I realized through talking to Gary Habermas and through my own experience that doubting is normal. Gary had told me once that he had a discussion with Antony Flew, the great philosophical atheist of the latter part of the 20th century. And he asked him, he said, "Tony, do you ever doubt your atheism?" And he said, "Gary, I doubt my atheism every day." And then you've got C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity. These are, to my knowledge, they're transcriptions or edited transcriptions of some things he did with the BBC. And at one point he was asked if he ever doubted his Christian faith. And he said, yeah, there are times he doubts his Christian faith. But he said, when I was an atheist, there were times I doubted atheism and, thought that Christianity looked more plausible. So whether you're an atheist, an agnostic or whatever, or a Christian, doubting is normal. We, at least for some people.
Yeah, it's a human problem.
Yeah. And, I recognized for me, I'm just kind of wired that way. It's just more than my faith, and I doubt. I doubt even silly little things, and I doubt important things other than my faith, So that's one thing. Another thing is I recognized, and I thought this was important, I recognized that the evidence we have for Christianity is pretty good. So, the evidence we have for the resurrection of Jesus, you combine that with evidence for God's existence, the philosophical and scientific evidence for a designer of the universe. We got a pretty compelling case that Christianity is true. So, that was something I looked at. I recognize that absolute certainty is not possible in things like this. Right. Absolute certainty is not possible in most things in life. And, and then I also recognize that faith is more than feeling or being without doubt. It's a commitment. So, Peter, when he was walking on water, And then he saw the waves and the wind. He began to doubt and sink. But here he was out on the water. So doubt in Greek, there's two words, or it means two things. Distadzo, it means to think two separate things.
Okay.
So and on the one hand, you are thinking, Peter's thinking, hey, this is pretty cool, through the Lord, he's allowing me to walk on water. But then on the other, he's thinking, well, but how can this be?
Right. It's crazy,
yeah. That's just some ways I dealt with it.
No, you've mentioned Gary Habermas, and for those that aren't familiar with Gary Habermas, he is kind of one of these titans in the Christian world, looking at evidences. He has these things called the minimal facts argument. He also does work in near-death experiences, and he's done some work on the Shroud of Turin, among a number of other things. Gary is kind of well known in the circles of kind of Christian apologetics. So when you were talking to Gary, what were some of the passages in the Bible that you discussed, or that you ended up, kind of researching, or even in your studies, that started to really just make you scratch your head and you say, man, this is a tough passage to swallow, and I'm not sure I can actually do it? What were some of those passages?
I'm not sure that there were any passages, Tim, and it depends what time we're talking about. He addressed me one way, and those initial doubts pointing me to the resurrection and saying, look, if Jesus rose, Christianity's true. And then the second time I doubted, he calls it the Baltimore call. I was living in Baltimore at the time. My wife and I were in Baltimore at the time. And this is the thing when the matters of gospel authorship and gospel contradictions were really troubling me. And then he would say, okay, Mike, well, look, if Jesus... Do you believe Jesus rose from the dead? Well, yes. Why do you believe it? Well, because we've got good evidence for it. What's the evidence? Well, we got a number of evidence, but let's just take, for example, your minimal facts approach that you just mentioned, Tim. And, you take facts that are so strongly supported by the data that even non-believing scholars are compelled to grant them as facts. And you can build a case for the resurrection just based on those things. So, these are non-Christian scholars who are granted these things, and you build a historical case for the resurrection on those. He said, well, that's right. So, Mike, listen, in terms of gospel authorship, we do have some evidence that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote this. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that none of them wrote those gospels. Did Jesus still rise from the dead? I said, yeah. Why? Well, because still... apart from gospel authorship, the traditional authorship, we still have compelling data that Jesus rose from the dead. Well, then, Mike, why are you so rocked in your faith over questions about traditional authorship? Well, that's a pretty good answer, Doc. I never thought of it that way. Right. But what do you do with the gospel differences, these alleged contradictions in the gospel? Mike, did Jesus rise from the dead? Yeah. Okay. Well, we've got answers to some of these gospel differences, but let's just say that there are contradictions in the gospels. Did Jesus still rise from the dead? Yeah. Well, then why are you allowing the matter of contradictions to rock your faith? Okay, well, I think I see what you're saying, but what do you do with the genocide text in the Old Testament?
Right.
Mike, did Jesus rise from the dead? And that phone call was a game changer for me. It was life-changing because I realized at that point that if Jesus rose from the dead, it's game, set, match. Christianity's true, period. And whatever kind of objection you want to bring up, it doesn't really change the fact of Jesus's resurrection. Now, I'm sure you can squeeze out of it and you can say, yeah, but maybe how do we know Jesus really was who he claimed rather than being an alien from a parallel universe whose PhD project was to deceive human beings? Right. And well, we can't know that, and I have to have faith somewhere. We all have to have faith regardless of the worldview. But I think most of us would say it is reasonable to believe that Christianity is true if Jesus rose from the dead.
Well, you mentioned a couple times, even in your conversations with Gary, where he's calling doubt on the authorship of the New Testament. And again, I think the line of objection would be something like, well, if we don't know who wrote these documents, then how can they be trustworthy at all? How can you know or take anything that they say with any kind of weight? So how would you address a question like that? Because I'm fairly certain that people that are watching this are scratching their head saying the same thing, even if this is the first time that they've heard that we're not certain that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were the ones that penned those documents. And again, that might be one thing that you grow up kind of just hearing in your Sunday school classes or hearing from the pulpit, and you get out into maybe the academic world, or you start watching some videos on the internet, and you're saying, whoa, I thought that was a fairly well-established fact that Matthew wrote Matthew. And then, so let's talk about that, and then maybe let's talk about how after that, let's go back to maybe the sharing of data between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So does the question mark of the authorship cast doubt on the truthfulness of the documents?
On my YouTube channel, I have a lecture on the historical reliability of the Gospels that viewers may want to check out. On my website, risenjesus.com, I also have a journal article that goes into some of these things in more detail as I compare the Gospel of Mark with Suetonius's Life of Augustus, and that is considered to be Suetonius's finest biography. Okay. So for those who are really interested in going a little more in depth in there, those are two resources they can check out. In matters of the authorship, here's the deal. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, here's where scholars are today. And when I say scholars, I'm talking about conservative Christian, moderate Christian, liberal Christian, agnostic, atheist, Jewish New Testament scholars. Yeah, there are a lot of New Testament scholars who are agnostics and atheists, and even a few Jewish New Testament scholars who are just interested in the person of Jesus, yeah, and what we can learn about the stuff. Okay, so that's who I'm talking about. This whole spectrum on the theological spectrum when I mention New Testament scholars. So the majority of New Testament scholars today think that the traditional authorship of Mark is correct. Okay. It's a slight majority, but it's still a majority. Yep. And the majority of New Testament scholars are not conservative Christians. All right. So the majority of New Testament scholars since 1965, I had a student, Joshua Pelletier, who did work on this. I interviewed him. That's on my YouTube channel. And he interviewed over 200 critical scholars since 1965, writing in English. Wow. And the majority do think that John Mark got his information mainly from Peter, the lead apostle, and that's who we've got. Craig Keener has done work with the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. The majority of critical scholars today think that the author of Luke Acts was a traveling companion of Paul and received a lot of his information from eyewitnesses as well as those who knew the eyewitnesses. They don't necessarily grant that it was Luke, but they don't say it wasn't. Okay. The majority of scholars today, according to Keener, critical scholars, think that John, the son of Zebedee, the traditional authorship of John, is not correct. They do think that whoever wrote John used one of Jesus's disciples, perhaps John, the son of Zebedee, perhaps a minor disciple who had traveled with Jesus, but that the Gospel of John is largely rooted in the eyewitness testimony of one of Jesus' apostles. And the majority of critical scholars today reject the traditional authorship of Matthew, and there's various reasons for it. So that's where scholarship is today. Now, we can only study so much during our lifetime or at a time. And a few years ago, I really hadn't gotten to the matters of authorship. I had accepted the traditional authorship, and I said, this is what I was taught, this is what the early church claimed, and this is what I will believe until I have a chance. It would be my default position until I'm able to look at the evidence. Well, a few years ago, I did spend some time looking at the evidence. I looked at a bunch of commentaries. across the theological spectrum, written by scholars across the theological spectrum. I looked at New Testament introductions that deal with these things, looked at the arguments, and really, I came to the conclusion that the traditional authorship of Mark, Luke, and John are correct. Now, I could be wrong. Okay, I'm open to that. In fact, I was open to it when I was studying it, and it's like, okay, once you conclude Jesus rose from the dead, these other matters, they can be a little troubling, but they don't trouble you nearly as much. Okay,
right.
But when it came to Matthew is difficult. I do think that the evidence suggests that Matthew was intimately involved in the penning of these Gospels. And one thing that really helped me, Tim, and I'll kind of wrap it up with this because I don't want to just drone on with this. I want you to be in the conversation. I don't want this to be a lecture. Granted, the evidence we have for the traditional authorship of the Gospels is not rock solid. It's not unimpeachable. Okay. But as I was studying about gospel differences, and I spent a bunch of time with Plutarch, and then later on with some of the other authors, ancient Greco-Roman authors, I found some interesting things. The evidence, the external evidence we have for the traditional authorship of the Gospels is actually superior to what we have for the authorship of Plutarch's lives. Yet no classicist today questions whether Plutarch wrote those biographies that have been attributed to him. The best data and earliest data we have that Plutarch wrote the biographies that have been attributed to him, Plutarch's lives, is what's called the Lamprias Catalog, which is falsely attributed to Plutarch's son. And the catalog was written somewhere between 100 to 200 years or even longer after Plutarch wrote those biographies, which led, shortly right up to his death. And the Lamprias Catalog contains some literature attributed to Plutarch, which most classicists think Plutarch didn't write them. So these are problems you have with that, and that's our best and earliest source that classicists rely on for the authorship of Plutarch's lives. We have much better evidence for that, for the traditional authorship of the Gospels. And I do think that some of the arguments that's used against the traditional authorship of the Gospels can be quite easily answered. Maybe not so much in the case of Matthew, but I do think that there's good reasons to think that Matthew was intimately involved in the composition of the gospel that has been attributed to him.
So in your studies, what you realize, I'm just kind of trying to sum up here, that when we ground our expectations of what it should be, of what authority should be, with other things in the ancient world that are written around the same time, within an acceptable range, the Gospels aren't outside of that acceptability. And in some cases, like you just said, it's actually more reliable because we have more copies that are closer. So we can say, sure, if you agree that this is a reliable historical, piece of work, then you have to also use that same standard to apply that then to the biblical work. And if not, then you're doing something that is, you're saying, well, it has miracle claims in it. Okay, well, that's a different issue. I would say a different issue, of a philosophical, metaphysical issue than just a historical issue. Would you agree with something along those lines?
I would. And I'd also say that some of the Greco-Roman and Jewish literature isn't free of miracles either. Plutarch has miracles and portents and things like that in his lives. Right. So does Suetonius, so does Josephus. But we don't discount those things because of that. Now, granted, the Gospels are a little bit different because they're based on the works of a miracle worker, of a guy who's claiming to be God's uniquely divine son. Right. So there is some difference there. But, you don't just discredit it because of the miraculous nature of the person involved.
Yeah. So real quickly, I want you to address some of the objections that go surround the idea that, well, you had Mark as the earliest gospel, but then you clearly have Matthew and Luke kind of borrowing some of his material. So really it's just a reinterpretation, or they're kind of embellishing, if you will, some of his work. So I want you to answer that question, but I do want to kind of foreshadow, we're going to get to interpretation and how we understand some of these passages in light of some of the aforementioned atrocities that you had talked about, or how do we know we have the right understanding of some of these commands or the historical accuracy of some of those. So we're kind of just largely grounding how we can trust these documents. And I do want to get Mike's scholarly opinion on how we then start to kind of parse out some of the principles that we apply for today. So that's coming. So Dr. Licona, can you talk to us a little bit about why doesn't the shared authorship or the using as a source cast doubt on the truthfulness of the Gospels?
Okay, sure, Tim. This is what scholars refer to as the synoptic problem. I don't know why they call it a problem, just because we don't know the answer to it with certainty, but it's more like a puzzle, okay, sure. The synoptic puzzle. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic gospels. It comes from two Greek words, soon, meaning with, and opsis, meaning view, see, vision, things like that. So you can view together Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you find that on a lot of occasions, the parallel stories are virtually word for word, so or very close to it. So just to give you an example, one that I give, let's just say you and I and our friend Bobby Conway and some others are in a restaurant. Okay, so you got Bobby, you, me. We're sitting at a table having lunch at a restaurant. And there's a couple at the table right next to us, and we overhear them, and they're arguing with one another. And over the next 10 minutes, their argument gets more and more intense. And finally, they're standing up, and she picks up a wine bottle, slaps it across the guy's face, creating a big gash in it. And just then, the police show up, and they handcuff the woman, take her off for assault and battery. And then you've got the paramedic is attending to his wound. One of the police officers comes over to our table and said, "Did you guys witness this?" Yes, we did. Did you hear the whole thing? Yep. You saw the whole thing? Yep. Okay, so he gives each of us a pad of paper and a pen. He says, "I want you to write down your firsthand account of this." Okay. Now, I just want you to think for a moment, Tim, how those accounts would differ. Not necessarily in the details, but how we worded them. Yeah. We would word them different because we have different personalities. Our writing styles would be different. You might select some details that I omit. Bobby might get some that the two of us omit, or we reword. We may put them in different order or something like that.
Mine would have lots of spelling and grammar mistakes. Your guys's probably wouldn't.
So yeah, so you'd have these kinds of differences in it. Okay, so they could be agreeing pretty much on the content, but there'd be differences in the way it's reported. So the police officer would pick it up, and the police officer would harmonize the accounts and look at them, come out with one coherent account.
Yeah.
But let's suppose the police officer got it back and it looked and saw that a lot of what we were saying was virtually word for word. That police officer would be justified in thinking that we had collaborated with one another rather than writing independent accounts.
Of course.
Now, let's go a little further. Let's suppose that couple had been arguing in Spanish. Let's also suppose that the three of us were fluent in Spanish, so no problem. But the police officer doesn't know Spanish, so the police officer asks us to translate our accounts into English. Now, anyone who's even remotely familiar with another language understands that the way that there's an art to translation. Yeah. And there's a lot of times there's no one-to-one correspondence between the words, the syntax, that is the grammatical structure of one language like Spanish is different from that which it is in English. And so the way I might translate something today may be a little different than the way I translate it tomorrow. Okay, that's just the nature of how translation works.
Yeah.
Now, let's suppose that the three of us translated it into English and the police officer got it back and found that it was virtually word for word many times. Well, the police officer would definitely be justified in concluding that we had collaborated with one another.
Yeah.
But wait, there's one more step here. Let's suppose that it's not 20 minutes later that we're giving this to the police officer, but 20 years later, the police officer would definitely know that we had collaborated with one another.
Right.
This is the kind of stuff you have with the Gospels. Jesus spoke primarily in Aramaic. They are reporting his words in Greek. They're reporting it somewhere between 20 to 40 years after the event. And a lot of times there is a verbal agreement between them. Sometimes it's word for word. Sometimes it's very close, which and seems to suggest that there is a relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels. And figuring out what that relationship was is what's called the synoptic problem. It's not really a problem, it's a puzzle. You realize that a lot of ancient authors, what they would do is they would take a single source, Plutarch did it, and you would supplement, you would use that as your primary source, and you would supplement it with other sources, even if you were an eyewitness to some of these things. Right. And so that's what the gospel authors are doing with Mark. Mark is the first gospel to have been composed, and then Matthew and Luke are using Mark as their primary source and supplementing it. So here, the difficulty that causes for us is that it's difficult at times when you have the story that's shared, that Matthew and Luke share with Mark. It's difficult to say that they're independent accounts. Right. Now, so that becomes a difficulty for us. Now, sometimes you find Matthew and Luke are very similar, and they disagree a little with Mark, at least on the way things are worded. Yeah. Then you might have some multiple independent source there. Matthew and Luke having one stream of source and Mark another. Yeah. So
no, I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
No, so okay,
I don't want to keep going on.
No, I think this is really good. So we've talked about the central aspect of the resurrection being important. Gary Habermas elucidated that for you. I've heard something similar, that we need to keep that as central. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 tells us explicitly that it is central. So as we're answering that question, Jesus walking out of the grave, we can say, again, I believe overwhelmingly, yes, through the evidence that you've laid out, through your scholarly study, through the inquiry that you had with Dr. Habermas. But now we get into some other kind of sticky problems. We say, given other ancient literature, if we're understanding it, kind of adjacent to one another, the Bible, even with some of these things that you've talked about, still should be given weight historically as it's true. But then we have this significant issue, particularly for today's culture, where they say, look, the Bible has been used over and over and over again for justifying war, justifying oppression, making women feel like second-class citizens. It's been used to justify things like slavery. So Mike, how can we know that your interpretation or any interpretation is correct? Shouldn't we just kind of move with the Spirit? If the Spirit has kind of moved on from some of those things that maybe were needed in Jesus' time, maybe needed in the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, as they're sometimes referred to, we've moved on from that. We should abandon some of those things. How do we, and I'm going to use a big word, how do we adjudicate? How do we discern what types of principles and what types of understandings, interpretations we should use for Scripture? I know that's a big question, so I'm going to just kind of lay it out there. You can parse it out as you feel you need to.
Well, it's a fair question, and it's not an easy one to answer, Tim. The fact is that we're never going to have a consensus on a lot of matters. We don't have it with politics. We don't have it with a lot of things in science. And we don't have it with a lot of things in religion. You're just not going to get consensus. That doesn't mean we can't know the answer. Okay. So, like, for example, here in Georgia, we recently had a new law that the Georgia governor and House and Senate have said it's to curb voter fraud. It is to make it more difficult for voter fraud to occur here in the state of Georgia. Yeah. So this is a Republican-controlled House, Senate here in the state of Georgia, and you have a Republican governor yeah. here in Georgia. Now you'll have a lot of the leftists. So they're saying that this will make it so that it makes it more difficult Well, actually, the way the law works, it seems like in many cases, or at least in some cases, it's going to make it easier to vote. So there's going to be drop boxes. There's, anyway, I could get into all this. I don't want to
Sure.
go into this because there's a debate over it.
Yeah.
And there have been, the Major League Baseball moved the All-Star game out of here, and we could talk about all that kind of stuff. So
Right.
you see, there's these different views. Well, what you would do is you look at the data, you go back and you read the 98 pages of the new law,
Right.
and then you read the critics' arguments against it, and you make your own assessments on who's correct in this. Are the Republicans 100% correct? Is the left 100% correct? Or is one correct, mostly correct, and the other mostly wrong? These are things that you would have to look at. And you would do this with politics. You would do this with science. Of course, you have to educate yourself in these matters in order to make an informed decision. And you have to do that with interpretations as well. Of course, there are going to be people who are giving bad arguments for political reasons. They do this for both sides,
Yeah.
of course. You've got scientists who fudge the data because it helps their view. You've got people on both sides of the aisle when it comes to conservatives and progressives and atheists who are interpreting scripture and what they say. You've got people who, in the South here in the United States, who abused and misinterpreted scripture in order to support slavery. And you got others who used scripture to speak against slavery.
Right.
So you just have to take it all into consideration. And then sometimes, scripture isn't going to address something in a direct manner, like the issue of slavery. Probably doesn't address it in a direct manner. And so that makes it easier to abuse interpreting the text.
Right. No, I think that makes sense. And there are things that I know that you've talked about in the past where, giving a modern day example, it's hard to understand some of the linguistic cultural mores, if you will. Some people, we can use things like kick the can, or my kids say often literally, but they don't mean literally because they don't even know what that means. There's, literally there was like 45,000, whatever, the dog jumped 8 feet in the air, literally. I'm like, and that's not actually what that means, but we understand it as this is happening, right? Like that's what it was maybe an exaggeration. So I think understanding some of those cultural and linguistic mores are really important to understanding some of the text. And we do realize that some people haven't done that work. Some people do that work, and they may come to different conclusions, and we can, talk about some of those and debate some of those. I know that you have debated several people, Matt Dillahunty, Bart Ehrman, Shabir Ali, right? You debated, yep, on, again, understanding and interpretation of the text, but being able to get back to some of those cultural mores, some of those linguistic mores is really, really, really important. I do want to. Do you have an example of that in the scriptures in the New Testament where we can say, yeah, there's this saying that happened? I guess one of the ones that comes to mind, maybe you can talk about, is Jesus saying that you should hate your father and mother, and what that really means, because someone could read it and say, well, they really mean to hate your father and mother. I mean, he means to completely disavow them, never talk to them again, have complete disdain for them. But is that really what Jesus is saying in that passage?
Yeah, it's a good example, Tim, the one that you give about hating your father, mother, and all your relatives. Yeah, well, back then, hyperbolic language of exaggeration, is something that was commonplace. We find it in other places, even in the New Testament, like when Jesus says in a Sermon on the Mount and elsewhere in Matthew, where he says, if your right eye causes you to sin, rip it out and throw it from you. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it from you. For it's better for you to enter heaven maimed than for your entire body to go into hell. So there's nothing in that, literally, that would suggest that we should not take that literally, okay? But when we look at the culture in which this is written, then yeah. So for example, you got Seneca the Younger, who dies around the same time that the Apostle Paul does in the middle of the 60s. He was considered to be Rome's brightest mind of the first century. Today, they regard him as that. And he said, in a letter, he said, if your heart is evil, rip it out. So, well, we can see that was a figure of speech of some sort. It was a linguistic idiom. Paul puts it a little bit different. He says, consider the members of your earthly body as being dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed. Consider your members of your earthly bodies dead to these things. So it's like, if you have problems with lust, if you think of yourself as being dead people can't lust. Yeah. Jesus, in the same way, if you rip your eye out, you don't have an eye to look on a woman to lust for her. So you're to consider yourself as blind, and then you won't be able to do these things. So that was a technique, a method to dealing with something like lust or stealing or whatever. You could do things like that. Yeah. Dead people don't care about the things of this world, right? They don't obtain things. So you're not going to be greedy if you're dead. Right. So, yeah, so you'd speak in this hyperbolic language. Well, when it comes to hating your father, mother, brother, sister, wife, and children, it's interesting. Matthew restates Jesus' words and takes out the hyperbolic element of it. He says, unless you love me more than father, mother, brother, sister, wife, and children, you cannot be my disciple. Okay, so it's this hyperbolic language. It's the same Jesus who told us to love others and even to love our enemies. Right. So he's not going to be also telling us to turn around and hate these same people that he's elsewhere commanded us to love. So it's the hermeneutics, by considering what the linguistic idioms from back in the first century, that helps us interpret these texts correctly.
Oh, well, Mike, I think that's a great place to wrap it up. We could go on and talk about this in far more detail, but you have done that in other places, so I would suggest that people head on over to your YouTube channel, to your website. I'll leave links for those in the description of this video so people can check out more from you. Mike, I appreciate you being open and honest and authentic with us as your processed doubts as the things that were going on in your life, and then you gave us the kind of just a layout of how we should think about Scripture and what is primary, what is the most important, and how we can look at the different understandings of ancient text, and then how other scholars in your field that don't have the same background as you are able to still give a trustworthy credence to those other documents, but then they can also give that, if we use that same standard for Christianity, and your hermeneutical method that you kind of laid out there at the end, where we can understand hyperbolic language and we can, know what the author is trying to say. So, Mike, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining me today on Dealing with Deconstruction.
You're welcome, Tim. Pleasure to be with you, brother.
Thanks. If Mike said something that resonated with you, I hope that you were able to lovingly look at Scripture through the lens of truth so that we can put one more board back in your construction project of Christianity. There is a loving Facebook community that I want to invite you to, no matter where you are at in your journey. The link for that is in the description. In the words of my friend Bobby Conway, I'm inviting you to doubt toward faith. See you next time, doubters, as we deal with deconstruction.